Welcome to ENG 315, English Poetry. Study Section 1, Beginning of English Poetry. Introduction. An understanding of the beginning of English poetry will provide you with insight into the contribution of pioneer English poets. It will also help you to underscore their influence on later English poetic forms. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this section, you should be able to define and use correctly the term poetry, discuss the history of English poetry. Terminology. Poetry, a rhythmical composition designed to convey experiences, ideas, or emotions in a vivid and imaginative way, and characterized by the use of language and literary techniques. Poem, a piece of writing in lines where the expressions of feelings and ideas is given intensity by particular attention to diction, in bracket, sometimes involving rhyme, rhythm, and imagery. Definition of poetry. Hints. We will commence this section by reviewing different definitions of poetry in order to expound your prior knowledge of the definition, nature, and characteristics of poetry. One of the important yet less patronized genres of literature is poetry. It is important in the sense that it permeates most natural endeavors and is produced by all things in nature, such as rivers, mountains, hills, wind, and human experiences. Whereas Da Silva and Jegede, 2005, 1, trace its sources to the orderliness of nature, such as the sound of the birds, the movement of the waters and the trees, the whistling of the wind, which they said are poetic, and equally served as a source of inspiration for its creation. Aristotle attributed its origin to the natural instinct to imitate and also to take pleasure in imitation. It is less patronized because its deep conventions of language make its meaning elusive to many readers who do not have the patience to investigate its different levels of meaning. Poetry is said to have derived from a Greek word which means to make or to create. The idea is that it is created from artifacts, a structure that develops from human imagination and is expressed rhythmically in words. The best way to understand it is to experience it, read it, study it, memorize it, question it, and talk about it. Several attempts have been made by scholars at defining poetry. These attempts shows that poetry means different things to different people. Let us examine some of these definitions so that you can attempt to define poetry in your own words. Indeed, the essence of poetry is found in the compression, economy, or force of words. A selective use of words and specific forms or modes of being differentiates it from other genres of literature, such as drama and prose. The first is that in poetry, attention is paid to sounds and connotations. The second is that the poet makes greater use of resources of meaning, such as figurative language, allusion, symbol, and imagery, than the novelist or playwright. Its function is to please and entertain. No matter which of the senses poetry appeals to, its main aim is to give pleasure, to inform and instruct its readers. FBO Akpobaro 2003-91 states further that poetry can be defined in terms of the nature or form that is put on its material. According to him, the most important of these formal features or aspects are: 1. The physical form or appearance of the poem, 2. The figurative use of language, and 3. The pattern of sound. Each of these elements is given a pronounced emphasis and predominance over the others, according to either the prevailing concept of poetry of a given period or culture, or by a given individual poet. It is, however, necessary that for a species of composition to be significantly described as poetry, it must give full expression to one or more combinations of these aspects. Hint: these key aspects of poetry, the physical form, the figurative use of language, and patterns of sound, will be discussed in subsequent study section. History of English poetry. Roland Carter and John Macrae, 1997-35, argue that the history of English poetry is traced from Geoffrey Chaucer, since most of the poems written before him in the Anglo-Saxon period were by anonymous authors and published as survivors. The Anglo-Saxon poems were referred to as Old English poems, and they included Caedmon's hymn, Vercelli book, Exeter book, and Beowulf manuscripts. While some of the manuscripts survived as fragments, Beowulf was the only one that survived in its entirety. There were also religious and alliterative verses and elegies like The Wanderer and The Seafarers. Major works of English literature appear in the 14th century after the Norman conquest of England in 1111. This includes Piers Plowman, Sir Gawain, and the Green Knight, and Chaucer's poem, which were considered to be comparable to the works of Virgil and Dante. They included Trillus and Christy, The Legend of Good Women, and the Canterbury Tales. They were some of the most unique poetry collections of the medieval period. Chaucer exhibits his descriptive power in the poems, and through The Legend of Good Women, he introduces the use of heroic couplets for the first time into English poetry, while in the Canterbury Tales, he gives a wide background of the people and society of 14th century England. And through the characters, ridicule manners and behaviors that were affected, materialistic and corrupt. According to Margaret Drabble, 2000, Chaucer's writing developed through his career from a period of French influence in the late 1360s through the middle period of both French and Italian influences to the last period of most of the Canterbury Tales and his short lyrics. The tradition of poetry in the medieval period was continued in the Renaissance, and Sir Philip Sidney, who was considered to be the true representative of the age, embodied the medieval virtues of a knight, the lover, and the scholar. Carter and Macrae, 1997-57. His text, Astrophel, Lover of a Star, and Stella, Star, published posthumously in 1591, contained 108 sonnets and 11 songs. It popularized the sonnet, which was introduced into English poetry by Thomas Yates, and indeed started the love for sonnet sequences. Early Renaissance poetry was concerned with the idealization of women on the one hand and love sonnets on the other. The earliest of the sonnets were said to be written by Sir Thomas Yates and Henry Onward. Both poets translated Italian, Petrarch, sonnets directly into English poetry. They were patronized by members of the upper class and concerned with subjects of love, impermanence of life, loss, change, and loneliness. Alice Preminger and T.V.O. Brogan, 1993-340, wrote that English poetry emerged in the Renaissance period with the publication of a pastoral poem by Edmund Spenser titled The Shepherd's Calendar, 1579. The pastoral genre is an important Renaissance form which idealizes rustic life and celebrates a golden age of simplicity and leisure. In the Farewell Queen, 1590, it brings together English myth and eulogy of kings to write his praise poem. Roland Carter and John Mackay, 2001-58, described Chaucer as Spenser's favorite English poet. In constructing his allegory, Spenser was accurately alive to the traditions on which he was building. However, apart from Chaucer, Spenser was also influenced by Malory and classical epic writers like Homer and Virgil. Poetry can be a poem or class of poems, an instance of verbal acts, a text that is set in verse, bound speech which conveys heightened form of perception, experience, meaning, or consciousness in heightened language or mode of discourse. Rhythm, lineation, and meter, figurative language, sound devices are significant features of poetry. Beginning of English poetry can be traced to Geoffrey Chaucer, while Old English poetry is traced to the Anglo-Saxons. Study section summary. In this study section, we explore the meaning of poetry as propounded by different authors. We went further to note the significant features of poetry. 1. Reading. 2. Lineation and meter. 3. Figurative language. 4. Sound devices. Lastly, we outline the history of English poetry. End of study section 1. Thanks for listening.